Well, good morning, and if I can gather you back together. We're just giving ourselves a little bit extra time there this morning. We've had some exciting technology issues, so friends on the live stream, we are sorry that there is no live stream at all. But hopefully later on, friends on the live stream, you'll be able to watch a recording, and that will, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. I love technology. Do you know that? I really love technology, even when it misbehaves and does heaps and heaps of bad things for us. I really like technology still, and I think it's a tool that it's worth us using despite all the struggles. My name's Matt. I'm one of the leaders here at Hope City, and it's my privilege this morning to speak to us together from the Bible. Now, it was the 26th of February this year that we started into Jesus' famous set of teaching, often called the Sermon on the Mount. So it has taken us 6 whole months to get from one end of that to the other. The 3 chapters it takes up in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew's biography of Jesus in the Bible, that's quite a while. But the reason we took it slow was because there was so much packed in. So many things that we wanted to talk about and think about together. So much to consider that Jesus is teaching us. Today, we come to the closing moment. Drama, drum roll. As Joe's already signposted, today's gathering is going to have quite a different shape as a result. And we want to make sure we all have the chance not just to listen and think about what Jesus has said, but to actually go about doing it as well. And a really sensible way to finish this block of teaching, as it turns out, because that is exactly the warning Jesus gives to his hearers as he finishes up. Don't just listen to these words, but put them into practice. So let's begin together by listening to the end of this block of Jesus' teaching. Liz is going to read for us this morning, and we're in Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 24. That is page 972 in our Bibles. Matthew 7, verse 24.
Okay. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Thanks, Liz. Now we're going to zoom out again. We're going to consider the whole of Jesus' teaching, like Joe said earlier. But before we do, we're going to work through this last section and look at how Jesus lands the plane here as he finishes. See, Jesus draws this final dividing line at the end of his teaching between 2 builders, between a wise one and a foolish one. And the first thing we need to see is who Jesus' line divides, because, as it turns out, the wise and the foolish builders both have rather a lot in common. First up, both hear his words. Did you see that in verse 24? Everyone who hears these words of mine on the one side. Then on the other side, exactly the same in verse 26. Everyone who hears these words of mine. Hearing Jesus' teaching is the common ground. Jesus divides everyone who hears his teaching. He divides them into wise and foolish. Both hear Jesus' words. That's not what divides them. That's not what determines at the end of this picture whether they'll stand or whether they'll fall. Second, both of them are building a house. And Jesus doesn't really make any comment on the square footage or the number of bedrooms. Doesn't call out anything about the design or architectural choices or materials they're using. Doesn't say any of that makes the difference between standing and falling. Jesus is obviously talking about our lives here, and perhaps there's something in the way he doesn't make a big deal about one house was bigger or one builder was richer or anything like that. They both just lived a life, as far as outside appearances go, that looked pretty similar, had quite a lot in common. Both are building a house. It's not what divides them. It's not what determines whether they stand or fall. Both face a storm. Jesus uses almost exactly the same words to describe the storm both builders are facing. They're so similar, our translation chooses to use exactly the same ones. Now, what's Jesus saying to us there? What does this storm represent? Is Jesus saying every life has similar trials? Every life has almost identical difficulties and struggles. Is that what the storm represents? Well, I don't think so. I don't think that describes reality very well. I know here, many of you face trials that would dwarf anything I know about in my life. So if the storm's maybe not trials in this life because it's so consistent across the two builders, what could it represent? Maybe persecution? Now, persecution is something that Jesus has talked about quite a lot in this block of teaching. Is Jesus saying here all of his followers are going to face similar persecutions? Well, again, that doesn't add up very well. That doesn't explain or describe reality. Here we might face an unkind word. Around the world, for our brothers and sisters, it's life and death. So what do we think the storm is? I think we have to understand the common storm that Jesus is speaking about here is what Jesus called that day in the teaching that we looked at last week, in the words Jesus spoke immediately before today's passage. That day at the end of life when some will enter the kingdom of heaven and some will be turned away by Jesus himself, right? Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. I'll tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. That day is a storm that every builder, every single one of us is one day going to face. And that's where the similarities end, right? Both here, both live, both die, but only one stands and one falls. And the difference is in what they build their life on the foundation of their life. And Jesus underlines that for us as he's teaching, right? It did not fall because. Why? Because it had its foundations on the rock. Both houses looked fine until the storm came. Foundations might not seem that important. They might not seem to matter that much, not until the storm, but they'll be revealed on that day when it comes. That's the key difference Jesus is pointing us to here. Not what you've heard, not even what you face in this life, not even what you face on that day to come, but what you do with these words of mine, as Jesus puts it. Do they put them into practice? Literally, do they do them? That's the language underneath. Do you do these things? Or do they not put them into practice? That's the dividing line. It's a bit Yoda, isn't it? Do or do not. Only two sides, nowhere at all in between. That's the different foundation. That's the different thing you can build your life on. That's the thing that will stand through the storm which is coming for us. You want your life to stand through the storm? Of course, we want our lives to stand. So what are we meant to do to see them stand? We're meant to lay a different foundation. Jesus says, don't just hear my words. He says, do them. Jesus is clear. You got to give him that, right? He is clear here. There really is not much room for doubt or confusion about what Jesus wants to happen. He is all too clear. He's uncomfortably clear. We've heard all he has to say. Now, Jesus' question, the way he chooses to land the plane and finish the whole thing is, are you going to do it? Simply whether you're going to do it or not. Now, when Jesus finishes teaching here, the next thing we read, I bolted in with this passage because I think it's important. We read that people are amazed. They're amazed at his teaching, verse 28. Now, it's pretty common for people today to say, Jesus taught a lot of nice stuff. He had some good ideas. It's great moral teaching that you'd find in the Sermon on the Mount. It all just got a bit tangled up with lots of stuff that Jesus never really invented later. That's what people would tell you. But here's my problem with that. If the Sermon on the Mount is just good moral teaching, right? If it is, just Jesus telling us how great it would be if we were nice to each other for a change, as Douglas Adams put it in the Hitchhiker's Guide, is that really so amazing? Is that really going to stun a crowd? Have them gape? Be nice, Jesus says. Everyone says, wow, never would have thought of that. Thanks. I don't think that would amaze anyone at all. And I don't think that's a fair characterization of the Sermon on the Mount. Be nice is not the central instruction. Do you know why they're amazed? We read about why they're amazed. They're amazed because he taught as one who had authority. He taught as one who had authority. He speaks, like it or not, as if he is in fact the Lord, the one who people should hear and obey. The one who will either welcome people to heaven or turn them away. That's who he's speaking as here. When he speaks, he equates his words with God's words. The last two sections we read, do the will of my Father in heaven, hear my words and obey them. He's paralleling the will of my Father in heaven with Jesus' own words. If I had to sum up Jesus' teaching in two words, it's not be nice, it is obey me. Obey me because the Lord speaks. 6 times in this passage we heard Jesus say, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. 6 times he says, truly I tell you. Jesus is speaking as Lord through this teaching. This is not go and be nice. He speaks to us as God, and he speaks to us expecting us to obey. And that's the point he rubs in this final picture of the two builders. That's where Jesus chooses to land the plane on this whole block of teaching. He doesn't say, so you heard everything I had to say, now go away and be nicer. Right? He chooses to finish this with do it. But wait, you might be thinking, isn't Christianity all about grace? Isn't it all about getting what we don't deserve? Not about works, not about earning something by our own good behavior and excellent performance? How can Jesus put so much emphasis on doing then? How can that be his final word on the matter? To declare obedience as what will determine whether we stand or fall on that day. Well, if you've been with us through these last months, you'll know that we framed and seen all of this teaching as Jesus' blueprint for his kingdom of transformed hearts. And that is the key. That's how all of this fits together. Doing what Jesus commands, the righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, as Jesus described it way back. As we've seen it again and again, that righteousness is an inside-out righteousness. A doing and obedience, yes, but one that can only come from a God-transformed heart. Grace is the root, right? In his grace, God transforms our hearts. Obedience is the fruit, evidence, not earning it. So we're talking about an inside-out righteousness that's impossible without God's gracious transformation. Now, taking that on board, hearing what Jesus has said to us, what we're going to do this morning is spend the rest of our time focused on trying to get specific about a step to take, about an area to work on towards not just hearing Jesus' words, but doing them, but putting them into practice. But that only makes sense as seeing that as trying to bear the fruit of God's gracious root. So if you don't have that root, if you haven't asked God to transform your heart, don't get ahead of yourself and start trying for fruit with no root. Hear Jesus' warning about the coming storm. You should hear that warning. Hear how obedience is critical, and do business with God, asking for the heart that will obey from the inside out. But if you do have that root, and here's the thing we need to know, we saw this a few weeks back, if you've asked God for this heart, you do have it. Remember what Jesus taught us in Matthew 7 and 8. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. There is no question about it. The prayer for the transformed heart is the prayer that is always answered. So if you've asked for it, you have it. It's time to fertilize, time to water that root and bear some fruit. Now, we've been thinking about the best way to get practical, and the team has done a brilliant job of putting together these wonderful handouts that you should be able to find one of near you. And these summarize Jesus' teaching as we've been working through it for the last 6 months. There's a digital version in the app, and if we ever get our stream back together, then we'll post a link to that in there too. And we've covered a lot of ground, right? If you open this up, you can see how much ground we covered. Jesus said a lot of things. He gave us a lot to think about. There's so much here, this can feel pretty overwhelming. And we don't think the right answer is to try and take it all on at once. We think the right answer rather than going after everything and getting completely swamped, is that we make time for each one of us to pick one thing, one area that particularly spoke to us or challenged us or resonated with us, and then think with that one area about some practical next steps that are related to doing it, not just hearing what Jesus has said. So, you can see on the handouts there, a lovely picture of the handouts, we've got this cover. Sermon on the Mount reminds us that this is for transformed hearts. This is not possible without that transformed heart. And then if you open up that first door, you get the foundations. That's where we understand it to talk about a transformed heart, explains how that fits in. And then if you open it up, you get all the different topics Jesus has covered, which are these words of mine that Jesus is speaking to us about today. Heard these words of mine, put them into practice. And then on the back, there's a little space for us to respond, or there's a fill-in note in the app if you want to do that digitally. Now, hopefully, if you've been with us through the last month, these summaries are going to help you link back and think back to all the different things we've been studying together. If you've only just joined us, or if you joined us part way through, don't worry, you can just pick somewhere to start from the things you've heard. If this is your very first Sunday, you can still join in. We'd encourage you to think, to pray, to see what the Spirit draws you to as we begin to look for a particular place to put our focus in this next season. Now, the references for each passage are in the handout, so you can find them. We're going to take time to prayerfully and thoughtfully work through this together in the remainder of our time together. But as we begin that, I want to pray, because we know the only doing that can happen here is a doing in dependence on the God who transforms hearts. So I'm going to pray, and then Joe will take us forward. Lord God, Jesus is sometimes clearer than we would like. Here he's asking us for something that seems hard, perhaps impossible, and yet something that we believe, as we've read in studies, is the fruit of the transformation that you graciously work on our hearts when we ask. Now, for anyone here who doesn't yet have that transformed heart, I pray that they would speak to you and that you would answer that prayer like you always do. For those of us who know you as Savior, Lord, may we also know you as Lord. Work on our hearts to enable us to do what you say, to put into practice these things. God, I pray for your guidance now, that your Spirit would be at work on each one, pointing us to and leading us to something that is your next step for us. God, we do all this. Help us to remember the cross, to remember Jesus' grace. And yet, we do all of this hearing his call to put these words into practice. Help us not overbalance on either side. Help us today. Amen.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. So, shortly we're going to have space for each of us to prayerfully consider one area that we want to think about. And to get the thought process going, I've invited a few people to think about it beforehand and come and share with us. So, David, and Ellen, would you be able to come and join me? David and Ellen. Fantastic. Whichever David gets here first can go first. David P wins. David P takes it by nose. So, David P, here's a microphone. So tell us, what are you planning to focus on? What are your next steps?
It's really difficult, actually. As Matt said, there is just so much in these 3 chapters, but I guess the phrase that kept coming back to me as I read it was Matthew 6, verse 20, store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Now, maybe that's because I'm a little bit older, and I've just become aware that the things perhaps I put my trust and hope and ambitions in passing, and they don't last. And I need to concentrate on what really matters. So that's the phrase that's been really, really impressing on my mind. And then I began to thought, well, how do you do about that? How do you go about that? And actually, you just need to go back through the Sermon on the Mount. And there you have it. It's your blueprint for a transformed heart. It's not unsurprising that the next verse, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So, it's really important.
I have one attached to me. And is there anything particular you're going to do to help you go back through the Sermon on the Mount, David? You seem
Yep.
to have some resources in your hand.
I have resources, yeah, indeed. So, yeah, some practical things, some wee things, which I thought about this week. Okay, so I put the verse on my lock-in screen, so when I open my iPad, if I open my iPad, there the verse is there, it's down the bottom screen.
Oh, with some beautiful blue flowers, Matthew
Beautiful.
6:20, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, and
So
flowers.
I've done the same in my study, so just below my computer I put a little notice, so when I turn my computer on, the verse is there. I met with my son yesterday, and he suggested putting a tattoo on your arm. But I didn't do that, so I just step too far, for me anyway. Yeah, and then I thought, my mind went to a book which some of us studied a wee while ago in a book group called Eternity Changes Everything. It's a small book. We studied it in a matter of weeks. I really recommend it because it focuses your attention on heaven and how that transforms how you live today. So I'm going to be studying that with my son over the next few weeks or months, and he's agreed to do that, which is great. So that's the practical steps that I'm taking.
Fantastic. And you've enlisted somebody to help you there as well.
I've enlisted someone, and I've got someone in the front row here who will keep me on track as well.
There we go. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Maybe over to Ellen. Let's go, boy, girl, boy. David, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing. Ellen.
Thanks. Yeah, again, there's just so many things that came to mind that really was helpful to think about at the time. But one thing, to be honest, was one thing that kind of has happened already, but is still probably in process as well. It was going back to quite near the start of the reminder that God said to pursue reconciliation and to not hold anger or resentment against someone. And at that time, I definitely had anger and resentment towards somebody, and it was just totally on point for that week, those months. And so it was such a great reminder to bring that to God, to recognize that He is our judge, and to come before Him in prayer and taking it to Him, but also to actually pursue the reconciliation, to try and bring peace and try and be peacemakers. And so I did, met up with that person and talked it through, and that really helped. And I think in some ways there has been brought peace into that situation. But also sometimes those thoughts still creep back into your head. The mind is a bit of a battlefield, isn't it? And so I'm still processing through that. And in those times when I feel resentment or anger towards them, I'm still praying to God and trying to come up with some techniques, even some sort of little kind of sentences, prayers that I will want to memorize and bring at that moment when that thought comes into my head. I've also found it useful. Shout out to my very small groups, woohoo, very small group, and those girls have been amazing in asking me about how I'm getting on with that and keeping me in check with that. Also, I was thinking as well, obviously I enjoy to make music, and I have sort of been processing a bit through writing, songwriting, and also kind of enjoy a bit of like scribbles and drawings or whatever. So there's different ways to just continue to meditate and think over that and process it through. So yeah.
So there's a theme of creativity emerging here, that we're going to write songs, we're going to do body art. Over to David. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you so much. David, what are you thinking about focusing on?
I think the Sermon on the Mount series has challenged the way I reason and live in so many ways. One example is my response to the persecution of believers and Christian values in politics here in the West, and also the violent economical and political persecution of believers around the world. Most often, my response to this is grief, protest, and desire for justice. However, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 10 to 12, Jesus wants us to see beyond the outward circumstances, to see that those who are persecuted for their faith are blessed. And instead of grieving as like people without hope, we should actually rejoice for the reward that is stored for us in heaven. So I was thinking, wow, this is how I would like to also be responding every time I think or discuss issue about persecution, either around us or far away. And how do I do that? I thought I would like to always remember this passage whenever I face issues like this in the nearest future. So maybe the first thing to do is to memorize this section of the Bible and see that God will use these words to remind me of how to respond to this next time. So I'm working on memorizing Matthew chapter 5, verse 10 to 12, so that I would remember, or God will help me to remember. And secondly, I thought, once God remind me of this, perhaps the next response, instead of thinking and grieving, is to pray. Is to pray that these words will bring comfort to me or to anyone in the midst of this persecution, and for strength for the people who are under this persecution to endure to the end. But I was also thinking that actually is to rejoice, to celebrate the faith of people who are persecuted, because that means there's an element of faith there. And so I should be able to celebrate, but also to celebrate ultimately that our reward is in heaven. Even though the world see it as something negative, God is saying there is a reward out there. And I felt, my wife is at the receiving end of me complaining when I'm dealing with this issue. She might be able to spot how God is helping me through that. So I've enlisted her to be of help. But I thought there are a number of people that sometimes, once in a while, I discuss this kind of issues. They should be able to say, hey, we've seen your tone changing a little bit in this area. So.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. Thank you. So thank you to everyone for sharing. And it's now over to you. Rachel and Noah and Connor, are you guys going to do some pen distribution for me? I hope you've started to have some idea of where you might like to focus. That as we've been talking, you've just started. What I would do, guys, is just send the bags of pens in at the end of some of the rows, and people can sort themselves out. Take one bag to each side. So, John's going to play quietly in the background for us. And we're just going to have a bit of time, maybe, I think it's going to be about 2 or 3 minutes just to pray or think. You might want to use this time to pray by yourself. You might be a person who thinks best on their own, in which case take some time on your own. Like me, you might be much better at thinking out loud with another person, in which case please chat with your neighbours. There's no kind of must-do here. We know that committing to something is a really important step, so I'd encourage you, if you're able, to fill in just the first box on the back of your blueprint card. We'll get to the other boxes later. It would also be super nice to know where the rest of the family is focusing. So we're going to pop a link on screen, and if you're able to just share 1 or 2 words just to tell us as a family where you're going to focus. So I'll leave it to you for a couple of minutes. Thank you. pause just now. We'll leave the poll open. We'll have some more time to come back and think about practical steps in a moment. But we're going to pause to just worship God in song and remind ourselves of some important truths. As we spend time thinking about things we want to do, like Matt said, we risk forgetting that we first need God to transform our heart and incline us to want to become more like Jesus. We have responsibility to act, but that's always in response to what God has done. We're part of his family because of Jesus' death in our place, not because we made a list and ticked some things off. So over to John and Ellen.
Can we stand together?
Lord, I come, I confess, bowing here I find my rest.
So, you've picked an area. That might still feel quite big and unmanageable. We need more detail in our personal little corner of the blueprint. We're going to take some time shortly to think about some practical steps, and Dave and Ellen and Dave have already shared loads. Pick something small. One small step, actually done repeatedly, will beat some epic plan that fails after week 2. So let's say you wanted to focus on prayer for an audience of God alone, worshiping Him regularly on your own. Can I offer you a copy of Enjoy Your Prayer Life? They're down here at the front, which will walk you through just something about prayer. Or maybe you want to persist in prayer. You could join a small group next week. There's one with Ruth looking specifically at prayer, or any of the groups will be praying together. Some people find tech helpful. Maybe you commit to go into the church prayer requests each week when the text arrives, pray for 3 of the requests, and follow up with just one person the next Sunday to ask how it's going. Maybe you want to depend on God daily for what you need. Could you commit to praying as a household before your evening meal, thanking God for His provision and seeking it for the next day? Or maybe you're wanting to turn away from lust or anger. Could you commit to learning some Bible verses, either straight up learning, or there's songs for loads of verses, or John could write us some. Could you have a song ready in your mind to deploy when your mind wants to go down that familiar route of anger or lust? Ask a trusted friend for some verses, but how about the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 or the armor of God in Ephesians 6? Whatever you choose, and that's just some ideas that popped into my head, you need to have your own plan. But whatever you choose, how about finding a way to keep yourself on track? New habits take time to form. Ellen helped us see that. Is there someone you could ask to touch base with you? How about joining a small group? Maybe your group could make space each time they meet to say, how's everyone doing with their new habit? Could you chain a habit onto something you already do? I drive to work along the A71, and there's a particular point each day when I'm driving to work that I remember to pray for Hope City kids. So you do pick something you do all the time. Can you put a new habit onto it? Could you review your memory verses while brushing your teeth or waiting for your coffee to brew? In the olden days, I remember writing letters to myself in churches that someone held onto and posted back to me in 6 months. That's how much of a dinosaur I am. I think 6 months was probably too far. But could you set a 4 weekly reminder in your online calendar for 6 months to say, how are you doing with that thing that you planned? So, I hope that's primed the pump. Over to you. We're going to have actually quite a chunk of time now. We're actually going to take maybe up to about 10 minutes to commit to a plan, think about it, and pray. You've got the app to write on, the piece of paper to write on. This also exists in the app. If you are a digital person and you would rather have it where you're not going to lose a piece of paper, go in the app, click respond at the bottom, and along the top there's a wee tab that says something like reflection notes. So feel free to put it in there. If you'd rather have a piece of paper that you're going to come across, use the bits of paper. And use this time as you like. It might be that you want some time to talk with some other people, and you want some time to pray, and you want some time to think. There'll be prompts on the screen that will come up with kind of timers through them. But if it's a different way of doing this that suits you and you just want a bit of time on your own, honestly, just go right ahead. So I'm going to to pop back onto think. Fantastic. It'll go think, talk, pray, but do what you like, and I'll bring us back together to sing, to close at the end. So we have this time and then a song, and then we're done. Thank you.